couple of recall last time we were talking about, or I was mostly talking about so problems and movements and social change, social identity, really. And of course, today our main focus is going to be on that social identity. Really interesting stuff that Simi and company are doing with that. But I realized I kind of shortchanged the movements and change aspect of things last time, and just wanted to make sure we had a sense. So I think I wrapped up, and then go back and watch the video if you missed any of those notes towards the end. I sort of wrapped up with how the media deals with social problems, the carrying capacity of government and print and traditional media. But I kind of omitted almost entirely the discussion of the role of culture in social movements. And I want to make sure you have at least some sense of that before we get rolling back into identity today. So let me change my window here so I can see what you see. Okay. Yeah. So with movements, and I'm not going to get deep into this stuff. Obviously, you can take a whole class on movements with me next spring if you want to. But from a cultural standpoint, and that is kind of what we're going to be getting into a bit after this week, the cultural dimension of social movements. Basically, when we talk about movements, we're talking about trying to solve a problem via social action and that can be both in terms of trying to directly affect society. How bad is that?
Can you cannot see that?
You cannot see that at all. Okay. That's better, right? Yeah. Okay. I think I'll turn off some of the lights. So annoying. Sorry. That's a bit better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So social action, right? And that's just in terms of directly getting people to change behaviors. And so I think Griswold references Mothers Against Drunk Driving, if I'm remembering correctly. Oh yeah, the whole pietà thing. Dead children are like Jesus. That's yeah. I mean, there's a reality to that, and part of MADS, if you remember these guys. This was huge in the 80s. I think MAD's role has kind of declined since then because they were largely successful. But they basically had this two-pronged strategy of trying to get people to change their behaviors, namely convincing people not to drink and drive. And they had all these sort of programs for teens at the high schools, and they would put crushed cars from car accidents on flatbed trailers and show them to teenagers and say, look, drunk driving is a problem and you can solve it. So they're either trying to directly affect behaviors, or I think almost more often, they are trying to effect legislation, and other government action. And what all of that requires, so there are two ways, well, there are many ways to analyze social movements. Traditional analysis going back to the 60s, 70s was to focus more on the resources and the social structure of movements. You all right? Okay. The resources and the organizations. After that, though, from the 80s onward, there is a large focus on the cultural element here, and that is mostly under the rubric of what we call framing. So, and this is coming out of Goffman's work on just culture in general. How do we frame a person's actions, or how do we frame an event? You see somebody on the street freaking out, right? There are different ways to frame that. It's like, well, maybe that person is crazy. Maybe that person, is being threatened. Maybe that person is violently ill. You have to frame it in these different ways to understand what's happening and potentially to understand how to act upon that situation. And again, this is really important in the social movements literature now, because we frame different events in society differently, or we frame different social problems differently. And kind of one key way to see that is the abortion debate. It's kind of like nobody ever wants to be totally negative, right? So you don't want to be against things, you want to be for things. So on both sides of the abortion debate, they frame their arguments as pro something, right? So you're either pro-choice or pro-life. And as Americans, these are both things that Americans value. Americans value choice. Americans value freedom. Americans value this idea that human beings should be able to make decisions about their own bodies. That's a core value in America. Of course, life, beyond America, most societies, all human beings value life. Nobody wants to be anti-life. Nobody wants to be anti-choice. That's a very kind of simple, straightforward version of framing, and the framing literature gets really deep into how do you frame actions in order to get people to convince that it'll be a fun thing or a useful thing to do. But just kind of, I think, at the most basic level, think about the framing of social problems. And how a movement frames a social problem is designed to appeal either to certain people, as Griswold kind of, I think, maybe overemphasizes, to appeal to identities, or more broadly to appeal to core values, right? So again, the value of choice or the value of life. I thought I had one more. Oh, you're right. And then just, especially because we will be looking at this specifically. movements specifically work to deploy culture or cultural objects. In order to motivate, again, either motivate people to change their behaviors or to motivate people to access their legislators or to protest things, to enact political change. Most clearly, or at least I think the broadest study of this in the movement's literature has been this study of music. Either specifically protest music or music that works really as a framing device. I'm not sure there's a good overall term for that. But you know, in terms of protest music, and this will go a little bit to the article that Sofia is going to talk about today, where they talked a bit about how music really gets into the body, right? So it makes the participation in a movement that much more exciting and literally bodily exciting if you can join in singing a song like "We Shall Overcome" or something like that. It also makes the event more memorable, and it gives people this thing to hang on to afterwards. Like, there was that song we were singing. Every time you hear it afterwards, it will conjure up memories of the protest event. So we have protest music, and then we also have music as a framing device. In current music, right? Oh, the example being Childish Gambino, right? This is America. You know, is one way of framing like what's messed up with America right now. It's like, you know, shootings and materialism and you know, whatever else he's complaining about in that song. Also, you know, you can probably find many examples. You surely can find many examples. Bob Dylan, though, is, I guess, a master of doing this, and so things like songs like the Death of Hattie Carroll, about the death of a black woman, you know, basically, you know, not necessarily a call to arms, but a framing of you know the terror of America against African Americans. That or they made a movie of this one, right? Hurricane Carter. So Dylan wrote a song called Hurricane, about Hurricane Carter, Reuben Carter, who was a boxer who was improperly jailed for a crime that he didn't commit. You know, and so Dylan kind of, you know, told that story, exposed that story to a lot of people who wouldn't have otherwise heard it. But of course, you can find plenty of examples like that where songwriters and movements use music in order to frame certain events in certain ways, in order to make appeals to people, to do something about that. Okay, are there questions with that? That all makes decent sense? Okay. I don't see any protest. Okay, good. So now I'm going to turn it, wait, I'm going to grab some notes and I'm going to turn it over to Sophia. And so, Sophia, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should be able to click something that says, what does it say? If you click on the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I got it.
Present now. Okay.
Oh, no, that's not it. But yeah, I think I know what to do.
Okay.
I think. Okay, what can you guys see right now? Is it still me?
Yeah.
You can see your face. Yeah.
How about now?
Really fake.
You were
Just
for a second and then it went away.
Oh, okay. Okay, now can you see yourselves?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, can you guys see this?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So hello, I'm Sofia. So yeah, we read this article, Addicted to Hate, and it was pretty intense. And also I want to like welcome you guys to kind of jump in and like say comments or questions like throughout, because I think the study itself was like kind of straightforward. So main point, although people may leave a lifestyle behind, in this case extreme hatred groups, it does not mean that like the identity is completely gone from that individual. And I think that's an interesting like area of study, but I found myself like questioning why the hate group studies, like why study them, like why do they get attention? And then they compare this leaving the lifestyle to like an opioid addiction, which I think is also interesting because like you never, well, I've never like compared the two before. I think one's more severe than. And then they go into hot and cold cognition, and like this is like the neuroscience kind of behind it. And let's see, I have some notes on it. So the hot and cold cognition relates to a strong ideology that is especially important for understanding potential similarities between the addiction and the persistence of a rejected identity. So the hot cognition involves a heightened response to stimuli, and so that has like a lot of emotion and can kind of be like I said, fast and unconscious, which is kind of interesting. Like going back to like the examples they give of the people who are like I guess like recovering haters, and how they just like subconsciously like go back into that mindset even though they've been trying to change. And so I think that's really interesting. Like, and then I think the cold cognition is when it's like unemotional and like you're not like I think it's like the difference. So like the hot is emotion and the cold is like unemotional. So the responses were interesting. So we had the first one that was the momentary flashes, and this is when they talked about Brent with his attraction to like the Nazi music. And this is kind of what like Professor Dempsey was just saying, like the music is like involuntary action where he would like listen to it and kind of start getting into that same mindset. And I think that's like kind of similar to like the addicts who they, you know, if they're like around the partying, like they might try to start getting into that like same like mindset again. The second one was the situational relapse, and this is when Bonnie went to Jack in the Box, and this was terrible to read. If you guys remember, she like went in and like they got her order wrong, and so she was like, you know, screaming like get out of my country and like white power and stuff. And then she like left, and she was like, I was overcome by shame and disbelief, and I was just kind of like, I didn't feel bad for her. I was just like, I don't know. I didn't really get it. Like, I didn't get how that was just a relapse and not just like a continuing of like who she is inside. Like I get like the situation set her off, but like if the situation sets her off to that, then I think like she still is a part of it. Like you don't really get away from it. The second one is the strategies to resist residual, and this is when Darren kind of goes from like being obsessed with like neo-Nazis and like to being obsessed with like religion, and so it's like a way of him to like get his mind onto something else, to like obsess about something else. And I guess this is like a good example of like the hot cognition, with like it's giving him like emotions and like and he's like invested into it like emotionally. So I want to ask the question, like, are there addictive qualities to hate? Like, I know the article like went through and was talking like examples and everything, and sometimes I just didn't feel convinced. I just felt like it was a lifestyle that like people chose, and like we were just continuing to choose it. So what do you guys think?
I think once you start thinking that you're better than someone else, it's really hard to fall back into a routine where you think that you're equal to everyone, because you're losing that sense of pride and that superiority complex.
Yeah.
So I think that is addictive. Yeah.
I think another thing is like if you start hating something, then like in terms of like another person, like sometimes it gets to the point where it's like everything that they do frustrates you or annoys you, even if it's like something that you also do. But it's just because like you're like you don't like the person, you hate the person so much that like I kind of becomes addictive to hate someone. Like you like get pissed off at like every little thing that they do if you don't like them.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't make sense to get pissed off at them for that.
Yeah, I agree. I guess it's like you're addicted to like the emotion of the hate, you know, and I guess that kind of makes sense to me, but I just feel like it's more of a lifestyle, and I think that's my next. Yeah, so this is my next question. Does anyone think it was more socialization rather than addiction? Because, like, I don't know, addiction seems to like come like later in life, and then it's something like you're. I always think of addiction as like a disease, you know, a disease of the mind. Like my dad's an addiction psychiatrist, so I've kind of been like taught that, and I always thought of hate groups as more socialization, and like I feel like socialization is harder to get away from sometimes because that's literally what you were as like when you were growing up. So does anyone else kind of like, do you guys see what I'm talking about kind of?
Yeah, I feel like to like say that it's addiction in terms of like white supremacist groups is to say that it's like it's not necessarily their fault.
Yeah, and they did.
Yeah, it's like when you think of like alcoholics and stuff, it's like there's they have like underlying dispositions to like being addicted to alcohol or like stuff like that, and it becomes like a medical thing where they need to go and they need to like detox and go to AA and all that stuff. But to say that like white supremacists are addicted to hate is kind of just like to say that it's like it's not their fault and like they didn't choose this, but like
Yeah.
I think it's more socialization.
Yeah. Yeah, and what I was gonna say is like they did say in their study like we're not trying to like take the the blame off of them. And I was like, yeah, but that's kind of what I've been like reading. Like that's kind of like the tone I've been getting, like someone's like addicted to hate and so they can't help it and like they have like emotional responses and I'm like, yeah, but this is like bigger because it's like hurting other people, and whereas like addiction it just is like within yourself kind of thing. I don't know.
Like I feel like in the case of like the like exploding at like a fast food worker, like because they got their order wrong. Like, most people have control over like that kind of a thing, like exploding at someone in a restaurant or just like leaving and exploding. So like, I don't know. I feel like that's not like addiction. It's more just like, I don't know where I'm going with this. Never mind.
So, one more thing that I want to kind of like on this is that they say addiction is like a lot of thoughts, emotions, bodily experience, and unwanted behavior of a chronic, relapsing, and compulsive nature. And that, that does kind of fit with like what these like neo-Nazis, ex-neo-Nazis are dealing with. But I think the one thing that gets me is like the physical responses. So like, yeah, they get goosebumps when they're listening to music, but like, so do I when I hear my favorite song, and I'm not like addicted to that. So I think the reason I think addiction more goes towards like opioids is because they like have physical withdrawals from it, or they're like, shaking and fevers and like vomiting and stuff. I don't know. That's the other thing that kind of led me to like question this a little bit. Does anyone kind of know what I'm saying?
I mean, I think you also have to remember though that, I mean, you're thinking of the physical addiction model of things like opioids and alcohol, right? Um, and if you think of things like marijuana, right? People tend not to really become physically addicted to marijuana, but it can be a problematic aspect of their lifestyle. So I think, and you're right. There's kind of some definitely some nebulous definitions here, but something, somewhere in here they try to kind of make that distinction to say, well, it's not quite the same as bodily addiction, obviously. But they're framing, well, and here's a framing issue, right? They're framing addiction essentially as behaviors that you engage in that have negative outcomes in your life that you wish you didn't engage in, but you do so compulsively. So, I mean, in that sense, you could think about, I guess, marijuana use, or I don't know if any amongst you are addicts, right? But probably know some addicts, or even well, I guess smoking does have the physical craving sort of thing. Sex addicts or people who are in bad relationships. What? Oh, I'm sorry. Lady Gaga, remember the Bad Romance?
Mhm.
She, frames that in this sense of, if I'm recalling correctly, and you know people like this, right? The ones who break up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, but they can't stop sleeping with that person, right? They're addicted to that person in a sense, even though they know it's bad for them. They regret their actions afterwards. They still do it. Why do they still do it, right?
I guess it would be their hot cognition, the emotional side of things.
Right. It feels good in the moment. Or, what they're taking, they're trying to say is like, you get into certain behavior patterns. It could even be like, gosh, yes, probably at this stage yet. I don't know. Mary, did you ever eat meat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So did stopping eating meat, was that difficult for you?
No.
No.
Not for me.
Okay, for me, not that I'm going full vegetarian, I've been told as an older white guy, like, oh, you eat too much meat, it's gonna kill you. Um, you know, but then you go out, so I'll go out with my kids, or whatever, and it's like, nobody's eaten lunch yet. Let's stop at McDonald's, or like, how are you going to feed people quickly? My behavior pattern is, oh, well, we'll stop at McDonald's because that's what we're Americans. We just do that. That's just the way do it. And I'm going to regret that. And I know it's bad for me. And I wouldn't necessarily say, I certainly wouldn't say I'm addicted to McDonald's, but it's that kind of a pattern. And it does feel good, man. Eating like shitty food. I mean, it feels good, right? And I get that same sort of a sense from the Nazis. Of course, the semantic content, you're right, and maybe we do have to be reflexive about this, but I think what they're trying to say is these folks just can't be reflexive about it. Like you say, it's hot or it's fast cognition for them, right?
Yeah.
There's the show TLC's My Strange Addiction. And as we were talking about this, it made me think of that show. I feel like there's a lot of examples that we could have pulled from that.
Well, so what kinds of things, what are the strange addictions?
Oh man. Like there's one where this dude's like in love with his car, like romantically in love with his car. There's one where people are doing coffee enemas like 30 times a day. There's one where like a woman like drinks pig's blood. There's so many.
Right.
Oh, there's one where the woman eats her cat's hair.
Yeah.
Eats the cat's hair.
Yeah,
Like,
like shedding.
Yeah.
She's like, I just like it.
And they can't, or they have a very difficult time stopping that behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So there you go. You can get addicted to anything.
There's so many episodes.
Oh.
It's a great watch for these quarantine days.
Good.
And kind of like going back to the article, I get why they're studying this, like, subculture, I guess. Because they said like a lot of like research goes on like how people get into it, but like not about the people who like try to leave it and like leave it for good. And I guess that's like an important area of study. So like individuals need to understand how these past identities may continue to shape their lives rather than remain unaware of these influences. And I'm just like wondering like why, like what's important about that, like how can that like lead to, like does that lead to change, or like what do you guys think about this quote? So why is it important that we're studying like this specific subculture, and like why is it important to study like how their how their hate like continues in their lives? Like, is that important to let them know, or is it important for like sociologists, or is it important for society? Like, what do you think?
I mean, I guess you could argue that like if you know that someone is like an ex-white supremacist and you like can see that they're trying to like make these conscious decisions, and you kind of like are able to, I don't want to say like respect them because like I don't know if I respect them, but like you're able to like respect the fact that they are consciously trying to get out of that identity and move forward. But like you can't like forget, at least in my opinion, you can't forget that someone was like a white supremacist, but you can acknowledge the fact that they're trying to move past it and be a better person.
Mm-hmm.
Like that might be the reason why it's important to like understand the past identity.
Yeah. Anyone else have thoughts?
I mean, it would be important in every aspect of the three things you just said. It would help or help those individuals with those past identities move forward. It would help the people within those current identities who are trying to get out, or people who are trying to help them get out. Studying it would help them as well, and it would help people who are harmed by those identities to traverse the conversations and situations that they find themselves in.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe if like people are more aware of this, that it's like gonna be harder, then they can like work harder. Like they'll know it's not just an easy thing to get out of kind of thing. Interesting.
Yeah, and remember that comparison to other forms of addiction as well. So this is something that they try to teach addicts is, if if you really like club drugs, maybe you shouldn't go to raves anymore. It's like
Yeah.
you gotta know that once you sort of engage in certain behavior patterns and you have certain kind of ruts that your behavior follows, that the negative addictive stuff is going to go along with that as well. So if and I don't know that they were necessarily too clear about how uh, white supremacists can go about this, right? 'Cause it's not like a white. Well, I mean, certainly a white supremacist should avoid going to Klan rallies or that sort of thing if they don't want to be a supremacist anymore. But you can't not go to. Well, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't go to Jack in the Box if you're having a bad day.
Oh yeah, clearly. Tommy needs to stay out of fast food. So I kind of grabbed this quote. Disengagement from white supremacism is much more encompassing than simply disengaging from its activities or physically removing oneself from the group. And that's kind of like what Professor Dempsey just said. If you don't want to be a white supremacist, don't go to Klan rallies. But they're trying to emphasize that like it's more than that. It's more than just removing oneself from the group. It's neuroscience where you're like you keep going back to hot cognition, like the subconscious, like emotional responses to stuff. So we kind of answered these questions throughout, but does anyone else have like any lasting questions or comments or something they thought that was interesting from the reading?
What do you mean by subculture stuff?
I actually didn't mean to leave that. That was me thinking out loud on my slide. I was trying to kind of answer the question. So I was like, oh, this is like a subculture that we're studying, kind of like the pigeons. Like I was really confused why we were studying the pigeons, but it's just about like learning about these interesting subcultures and like how it like affects a society or it can like lead to interesting findings. Just like this conclusion, like it takes more to disengage from something than just physically removing yourself. But if anyone has like comments on subculture stuff, feel free.
Okay, everybody looks pretty satisfied with where they're at. Maybe
Yeah.
I'll go over and say a few things now. So can I? No. Can you stop presenting?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And I think am I pinned on your screen now? Or I don't have to be. I might do some writing. I might not. Just a good question though, right? About subculture stuff. The way I kind of was framing this for myself is around identity questions, right? So as we are now in kind of unit sort of on identities, and problems in social movements. Part of the question that I really have is, what does constitute identity? You know, this is a big word with I guess a lot of definitions that, you know, none of them I'm totally that I've seen are totally satisfactory. And that is, I think, essentially the subculture angle in this paper, right? It's so to be a member of the hate subculture is to have a certain identity. And I think, you know, this kind of goes back to a point that Griswold was trying to make last time, or in that chapter 5, that identity is a cultural object. You know, and everything about cultural objects that we've learned so far can or should or may apply to questions of identity as well. So yeah, again, remember, identity is a cultural object. Therefore, that is to say, it is created and changeable. And I guess what I'm taking as identity is not the same as self. So remember this: self can contain various identities. So you have an identity, well, or there is an identity of, you know, Eckerd College students, or there is an identity, you know, so there are various kinds of ethnic identities, or if you're an athlete, right, there is an identity of soccer players. And you can, if you sort of think in these terms, I assume most people do, right? So whether we like it or not, these stereotypes of, you know, well, surfers are like this. These are the kinds of things that surfers do. Or, you know, for my own, you know, research back in the day, jazz musicians do X, Y, Z. To be a true jazz musician, you know, you have to know how to play certain chords. You have to understand certain things about the history of the music. You dress one way or another, right? So there are these different performative aspects of an identity that's out there, like the white supremacist identity, that people bring into themselves, but the self may contain various different identities. So again, you may be an Eckerd student. Of course, you're an Eckerd student. That's part of your identity. There are certain expectations to that, but you contain other identities as well, as a member of your family, as a member of your ethnicity, as somebody who's, you know, an environmentalist or something along those lines. So, and to them, that includes roles and behaviors. And this is really where, as you did a really good job capturing, Sofia, the idea that an identity can become addictive is because that identity is associated with particular sets of behaviors. And again, that's the discussion we're having, right? Can hate be addictive? And this goes in again. Again, I'm like, in any future iteration of this course, I'll actually have you reading either the Vasey or one of these other articles that are referenced in here about different kinds of cognition, because this is really, I don't know that it'll last forever, but this is bleeding edge stuff in sociology in general and sociology of culture in specific, is questions about cognition and behavior. So you did good capturing hot and cold, right, in that one slide. So cognition can be hot or cold, and hot means emotional, and cold means unemotional. As cold kind of tends to mean colloquially, right? If you say like, oh, he's a pretty cold guy, or even cool, right? To be cool is to not get too like geeked out, obsessed, upset, excited about things. If you're cool, you're like, yeah, that's cool. Unemotional, right? That is an aspect of, well, arguably, of all of our cognition. And there are things, really like, when you're thinking about them. And I hate, everything's coronavirus, right? Part of what keeping your mental health going, I think, in these times, is to allow yourself some degree of emotional divorce from situations, to not get super emotional when you're seeing the news. Or if you think of it from the standpoint of a doctor, a doctor or a nurse in Queens right now has to be able to engage cold cognition, in order to clearly do their job. But obviously, and I know my stepmom was a nurse, so she would be cold all day at work and then come home and like throw up and bawl, cry her eyes out because of things that she'd seen at work, that she had to reserve that hot cognition for, for not when you're at work. You can't, if somebody gets a cancer diagnosis and they're going to die in 3 days, it's not helpful to sort of cry and freak out in the presence of that person, right? So, we have these two different forms of cognition. Cognition, though, is also fast and slow. And that distinction, I think, mostly comes from Daniel Kahneman's work. Oops. Who's also kind of referenced in passing, and again, they don't do a huge, great job really outlining this literature. I think there's some things that they missed. But Daniel Kahneman is this behavioral economist, won the Nobel Prize a few years ago because he realized that, and he's borrowing from cognitive psychology. He realized that a lot of economic behavior is really irrational, right? So something like, this is like, again, man, everything's coronavirus all the time. Have you been shopping lately? I mean, I mean, to the grocery store.
Yeah,
I haven't left my house.
You haven't looked. If you have to go shopping, you know, there's like a run on toilet paper now, right? And paper towels. I always buy Bounty paper towels. I mean, and I think objectively that they're higher quality, you know, but I bought some, I couldn't, right? I couldn't buy Bounty. I bought some Publix house brand paper towels the last time I went shopping. What's the point of this story? All right, the point of this story is buying brand name stuff is probably irrational, right? From the standpoint of a cost benefit analysis, you know, especially things like some paper towels, there's some perceptible differences. The fact that people buy name brand aspirin is foolish, right? Like is you know is literally irrational, you know, in the sense that it's the exact same stuff. The name brand versus the generic is the exact same stuff, often comes from the exact same factories. Kahneman's question is, you know, why do people do that? And the answer is basically because they don't slow down. They don't take the time to really think these things through. Something visceral or automatic, and this is what's more generally called type 1 cognition. Visceral, automatic things, you know, it's like, a Bayer aspirin, that must be good. You know, I see it on the TV. You don't even think that. You're just like, that's what you grab. You go to the store, you grab that. I go to the store, I go straight for the Bounty paper towels. I grab them, throw them in my cart, and go on my way. As opposed to, again, type 2 cognition, which is the slow and deliberative, as they say. And this has really, like I'm saying, made some major inroads in the sociology of culture in the last, I think the Vasey article was 2009, so in the last 11 years. The way that they take it is DiMaggio's appropriation of this, so that you get a 2x2 box of hot, cold versus fast and slow, so that you could have hot, fast cognition, hot, slow cognition, cold, fast cognition, and cold, slow cognition. And really the most problematic from the standpoint of these hate addicts, as they're calling them, is the hot, fast cognition. You know, that's the woman at the Taco Bell who just, and I think we have to, so I know you guys are like, you know, super critical of her, which, you know, obviously, yeah, being a racist, that's not a good thing. But try to understand that maybe those actions that she's taking are not really thought out. And yes, of course, we say, you know, as a should, people should think through their actions. But the reality is, you know, and the folks who really write in this tradition think that this is way more common. That the type 1 fast, unthoughtful cognition is really much more common, is much more of what we do in our day-to-day lives. You know, therefore, and that's where you get into this article, the self-talk that they talk about. You can talk yourself out of or into certain things. Partly that's, I guess, where they're kind of going in that conclusion statement that you pointed out there, Sofia, was if you know that this part of your identity is in there, right? If you know that your hot, fast cognition is going to go to the racist places, then if you can teach yourself, and that's really also a thing about, like, if you can give yourself the fast cognition, set triggers into your personality, your identity, yourself, to force yourself into slow cognition, then you can put some check on these bad behavior patterns. And also, final point, the goosebump thing is to assert that it's a bodily experience as well. And really, that is more in terms of these fast cognitions. This is this Merleau-Ponty phenomenological point that they're trying to make, is that this is not just something that goes on in your brain. And this is, a general problem in social philosophy, in the philosophy of the mind, in cognitive psych as well. The dichotomy between the mind and the body is a false dichotomy. Minds are situated in bodies, and your body will carry you places that you're not thinking of. So, and you feel this too, right? When you get, I think we all have had experience like the guy in the truck, where it's like somebody cuts you off. And not only do you cognitively think like that, and most of us hopefully don't go to like, some racist stereotype of why that person cut you off, but you are pissed off and you think that guy is an asshole, but it's not just in your head, right? Viscerally, your blood pressure goes up, you feel angry, you have a bodily reaction to those things. And that's, really, concerning and problematic if you've been taught to run in these racist ruts. Racists, right? Okay, that was a mouthful. Are there any questions? Look at your faces for a second. No? Okay, good. So Sofia, great job today. You guys saw, like, that's kind of a best case scenario, right? Where you get something that you can show in front of the class. But again, you don't have to do that if you're having problems putting together a decent presentation. You want to do it some other way. You're more than welcome to do it. However, I think, Jake, you're on Friday, right? With
yeah.
Okay. All right, good. Well, I'm going to sign off now then, and we'll be talking about transgender people on Friday.
Okay, bye.